it's great because we have this performance, it's on film, we can watch it forever. uh I like you said, like I really feel like he runs away with this movie.
You ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. My name is James, joined as ever by my good friend Steve, and this is Every Best Picture, where we go through every winner of the Oscar for Best Picture from Wings right to the present day. This episode, it's 1956's Around the World in 80 Days.
Hey, James, I'm really looking forward to our special guest, Josh Hurtado, who is another one of our returning guests.
So when we approached you, we put the question out to you and explained the point of our Every Best Picture series and asked you to pick a film, and you chose this one, Around the World in 80 Days. Why did you pick this one?
I actually did not realize that Around the World in 80 Days was a Best Picture winner until I looked at the list and I was like, you know what? No one talks about this movie anymore. And so I want to talk about it. And also, I'm a huge Cantinflas fan. Like that's part of my childhood. I'm Mexican American. I was born here, but have very vivid memories of being in my grandparents' house when I was young, and them watching Spanish language TV and Cantinflas being on either movies or the later Cantinflas cartoon show. I remember watching a lot. My Spanish is terrible, but I was always just sort of mesmerized by him, and this being, his one successful entree into Hollywood. I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I don't know anything about Cantinflas. I mean, obviously he plays Passepartout in this movie. They've obviously tailored the role for him because it was originally like a French character, and now he's obviously Spanish-speaking character. And you can see, I mean, with no context whatsoever, he's riding a penny farthing and he's doing all of these kind of little sort of subtle acrobatics throughout, and you're like, okay, this guy is clearly somebody special. So to those of us who, I mean, Steve, I don't know how familiar you are with this guy, but I had no idea. But I was like, okay, clearly this is a blind spot, and this is somebody I should know more about.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the movie because I remember watching this when I was younger, and of course I've rewatched it, and I always loved the character. But Josh, you could probably enlighten us more. You already have with just the intro to him, because I knew nothing about him other than I think he kind of steals the show in this film.
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge is fairly limited because, like I said, when I watched those movies when I was a kid, the language barrier was too high, and even still, uh, my Spanish is a little bit better now than it was then. But uh, unfortunately, a lot of Cantinflas's films are unavailable in any sort of English-friendly version. So not a lot of
Right.
subtitles out there for his films, not a lot of restorations. I live in Texas, in Dallas, and there's a large Latino community here. And so it used to be, when we still had stores that had DVDs in them, you could go to the store and there'd be a Spanish language DVD section, and there you would see plenty of Cantinflas's older films because a lot of people still know who he is. I have a Cantinflas poster in my classroom at school, and I still have
Mhm.
students who will come in and say, "Oh, my grandmother loves him," or my mother loves him.
Sure.
Uh, and so he was the biggest movie star in Mexico, period, for from the 30s right on through to the 70s. Um, and he made comedies. He was a comedian, and so the what he plays as Passepartout in this film is it's a sort of tampered down version a little bit of what he typically does. Um, but you can see that he was a dancer, he was a singer,
Mhm.
uh, he performed a lot of his own stunts. You can clearly see the sort of Chaplin Keaton
Right,
uh,
real
influence.
Chaplin vibes coming off him,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, yeah. And Charlie Chaplin, famously said that he had seen a couple of Cantinflas's movies and said that he was the greatest film comedian he'd ever seen.
Oh wow.
Chaplin said of him at one point. Um, but he never quite made the crossover into mainstream Hollywood success apart from this film. He made a bunch of movies before, and then shortly after this, in the late 50s and early 60s, he made a series of films that are actually some of the more well known because they were available on like proper American DVD for a few years. There's a series of 4 films that Sony put out uh, that are just they're gorgeous. They sort of highlight all the things that are good about him, the dance, the sort of personality that he has. He is Chaplin-esque in that he plays a version of the same character pretty much throughout all of
Mm.
his films. In one film, he's a priest. Another film, he's a theater actor. You know, he's a bullfighter. That's not a new thing for him in this film. That's something that he'd done many times before on film. Um, and you know, sadly, after Around the World in 80 Days, a few years later, he made a film called Pepe, which was a similar type, like large ensemble uh, film that was supposed to be another kind of Around the World in 80 Days that just flopped completely. And then he abandoned Hollywood entirely, which, you know, it's fine. He had a career.
Mm.
He
Mm.
didn't suffer for it, but he didn't get the sort of crossover success that he thought he might be able to land when that second film flopped.
So he was
It
like
must have.
the Paul Hogan of the 50s. You
Yes,
know?
yeah,
He
yeah,
gets that one hit and then
yes,
they try and give him a career and he's like, no, okay, you go home.
Well,
yeah, yeah.
James and I just were mentioning how Alain Delon, who passed away recently,
Mhm.
did the same. You know, he could never get crossover into America, and it must have been very difficult for a person of Mexican ethnicity in the 1950s to do so when you've got essentially the Indian princess in this movie and Around the World in
Mm.
80 Days being played by Shirley MacLaine. I mean, they were filling ethnic roles with white people. So, I mean,
Yeah,
it would seem almost impossible for someone of his ethnicity in that time period to really make it in Hollywood.
yeah. It turned out to be it's great because we have this performance. You know, it's on film. We can watch it forever. Uh, I like you said. Like I really feel like he runs away with this movie.
Mhm.
I wish there was more of him in the movie, but the sequences that we do get, he's clearly the most charismatic actor uh, in the film, and David Niven, you know, sort of
Mhm.
uh, by virtue of the character that he's playing, is fairly flat throughout the thing.
Right.
Um, but you know, it really gives uh, Cantinflas a lot of room to play,
Mhm.
and he really takes full advantage, I think.
Mhm.
It makes a lot of sense now, having seen this version, why, for example, Jackie Chan would want to do the role in the,
Mhm.
fairly terrible 2004 version. But you can see where the appeal of the character, sits, particularly after this one, where there is a lot of sort of, physicality, clownish
Mhm.
behavior going on that's not necessarily on the page, but that Cantinflas clearly has, brought to the screen. Because I mean, let's get into it a little bit more. I mean, obviously, I think most people know generally what the storyline is. It's I think it's interesting that it was written and it's set in the 1870s, kind of at the height of British colonialism, at the height of the empire's power. When the sun never set on the British Empire and all the rest of it. But then is obviously made in the 50s, and so right at the moment where the British Empire is collapsing, and it's right at the time of the of where India is regaining its
Mhm.
independence and what have you, isn't it, as well, and where essentially our US pressure after World War II is forcing Britain to
Mhm.
basically let everything go. And so it's a fascinating kind of reflection on the sort of the death of colonialism, or the and the out of touchness. And really what the story is there is a bet made at the Reform Club where it's impossible to go around the world in 80 days, and Phineas Fogg takes this wager that I could do it, and he does it purely for the money, purely to prove the other stuffy old men at the club that he can do it. And so he sets off that very day. And over the course of the journey, of course, he visits all of these wonderful, beautiful, exotic places, but he pays no attention to it. And I think that's a very
Okay.
sort of key part of the story, is that he doesn't really engage or integrate or get involved or enjoy himself even throughout the journey. And and that is the central theme of the story, is that it's this critique on British colonialism and British presence in the world, that they didn't give a shit about wherever they were. They were just there to sort of exploit it for their own financial gain.
Mhm.
and to, you know, and to come back home a wealthier, you know, prouder person as a result of it. You know, you got to note that it's written by a Frenchman. You
Mhm.
know, here there's no love lost between the English and the French, and that the Passepartout character was originally French in the book, and that he does this running commentary of just how ridiculous and how unengaged Phileas Fogg is. Whereas it's Passepartout, the character who gets in the mixer everywhere they go
Mhm.
and really integrates and really gets involved and greases the wheels for all of it to actually happen. And so you end up with this sprawling kind of epic movie where they go to many of the locations that they're supposed to go to, and they, you know, film on location and in this glorious sort of 70mm widescreen format that producer Michael Todd had sort of pioneered himself. Uh, but I feel that, and this was an issue I had when reading the book as well, is that there's something lost in the sort of sense of adventure of the story, because it's so invested in telling this or in painting this picture of the British as so unengaged and uninvolved and disinterested in where they are, that I feel that translates beautifully to the screen, but it's a detriment to the final product, because you end up with this sort of lacking sense of urgency, lacking sense of adventure really in the film, and it's more just, you might as well be flicking through holiday snaps or postcards or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, that's pretty, that's pretty, that's pretty, but I'm not really feeling like I'm there.
I agree. It feels at times very very like a travelogue.
Mm,
There, like you mentioned, there's all this wonderful photography from the Tadeo system that you were talking about earlier that Michael Todd pioneered. It was the second film shot in Tadeo after Oklahoma, um, and it was it's a lot of that travelogue footage is gorgeous. There's just a lot of that travelogue footage. And anytime anyone, like you were saying, does engage with the local customs, it's Passepartout, and sort of, you know, as you can kind of feel and sometimes, you know, even almost see Phileas Fogg sitting in the corner tapping his watch. You
yeah.
know, it's time to get out of here. Which is kind of funny considering how many sort of sprawling adventures they have where they don't seem to be in too big of a rush at all. You know,
Yeah,
Phileas
it's
Fogg spends a lot
interesting,
of
isn't it?
time.
Where there's like, I mean, the title of the story, it has an inherent kind of clock on the action built into it,
Mhm.
right? It's like, we got to get around the world, got to do it in 80 days, when that was a tough deadline to hit. And there's never this sense of urgency or you know, or drama until the very end, until the last kind of moments when they think that they've missed it, and then they realize they've crossed the international date line and they've still got one more day to go.
Well, just a couple thoughts on that. One, I don't have a problem so much with Phineas Fogg not engaging with the local culture because he is in a time-honored race here. He is that 20,000 pound wager translates, I think, today to 2.5 million pounds. And if I had a 2.5 million pound wager, I'm not going to be caring about the local culture. I'm going to be caring about how I'm going to get back to that reform club and make my 2.5 million. So that in itself is not the issue. One of my things that I found in this, I agree. This is just lavishly gorgeous to watch. But I felt like I was in the boat at Disneyland going through It's a Small World. And you go
Hmm.
into the Asia land and everybody's perfect in there and there's no poverty and they've got the dancing girls and they, you know, and this is Turkey and this is Spain and this is India and this is Yokohama, you know, and the boat's just going through and you don't see poverty and you don't see disease and you don't see, you know, the things that are normally associated with people just traveling the world. You see this is, and you can see this is for a audience that has not experienced globalization. They're seeing the other side of the world for the first time. And so and this is another thing we try to do, Josh, is try to put it in context. If I'm a young person sitting in the cinema in 1953, I've
Six.
never been to Hong Kong and I've never been to India and I've never been to these places. And I'm seeing them in this lavish, colorful palette for the first time. It's like, wow, this is spectacular. But for a 24th, 20, I was going to say 24th century, in 2024, we've traveled, we've seen the world. So it's like when we're seeing it on screen, all we're doing is saying, well, that's not like that. India's not like that. Hong Kong is definitely not like that. And so there's that little critical part of your brain that is thinking, I'm just getting kind of a very superficial, shallow. And if you can take it for what it's worth, like a ride at Disneyland, you can enjoy it for a few minutes, but it doesn't have a lasting impression when you're done.
No, I think you're right. I think there, if you were a kid in the theater in the 50s watching this, there is an inherent sense of wonder at seeing all these things that you maybe have only read about or seen in National Geographic or something like that, you know, and we don't have that because all of the, you know, kids from the ages of 6 years old have, you know, video machines in their pockets all day long, you know, where they can look at whatever they want. You know, none of these things are foreign anymore. And it's funny that really the only time where they experience you know, negative aspects of the locales in at a couple of points. One that I noticed, just because it's, you know, kind of forefront of my mind most of the time, was as they are getting ready to land their ship in India, there's a shot of the Indian coast that looks pretty dilapidated, you know, and then they sort of they coast past it a few seconds, but it looks like just a shanty town. And then they're immediately on, you know, the India set, where it's all white people in brown face and you know, the hucksters on the street with the, you know, the flute and the whole deal. And then there's the Orientalism of you know, putting Peter Lorre on the boat to Yokohama in full Mr. Moto mode. And you know, it's there are those aspects where it's like, oh, this is shady. I mean, at least they do it to America too, with the chase scene toward the end with the Native Americans, or Redskins as they're called in the film, which was lovely.
So they're equally racist to everybody.
Yes. I think that's the lesson to take from this.
It's uniform.
Like except Cantinflas, because who doesn't love that guy?
And to their credit, they never really make him seem like a buffoon. He's not played the fool at all, which I really appreciate. He's actually David Niven's Phineas Fogg. You can see where he has a very high standard of who he's going to allow to be his right-hand man, and he considers Passepartout, this is grade A stuff here. He might give him a hard time occasionally, but there's you never get the feeling where there's nothing but real respect. And when he loses him, he's in earnest to find him again.
Yeah, no, the buffoons are without a doubt the stuffy old men at the Reform Club. You know, who don't know how to operate without writing an angry letter to the Times about whatever problem they're having. You know, whether it be there's a cat or, heaven forbid, a woman walks into the room. They're completely isolated. You know, they rule the world essentially, but they're completely isolated from reality, let alone these other countries. Phileas Fogg, I mean, the other thing you have to say is that Phileas Fogg doesn't really evolve too much as a character. I didn't feel that by the end he's really kind of learnt his lesson, and he's come to a new appreciation of the world and the different cultures he has just experienced.
Well, he does have an Indian wife.
Well, sure, but in a very expat-y colonial kind of way. It's like, look who I brought home. Oh, yes.
I agree. There's no huge character arc. That's for sure.
Whereas Passepartout is sort of streetwise and street smart from the off. You know, you're Josh, you're right. He is of kind of indeterminate origin. You know, and it's only him that notices that they're not in France and that we're in Spain, you know, at the beginning when they first land the hot air balloon, and all the time, you know, he integrates perfectly. You know, he kind of understands everybody. He gets on with everybody as they go along. So it's fascinating in a way that you've got Cantinflas in this role, whereas all the other roles of interest, if you like, are all just played by Hollywood players in you know, insensitive makeup, which is especially irritating in a way because they do go to all of these places. I mean, I was quite looking forward, especially to the Hong Kong bit, obviously, and short of one establishing shot. I mean, you got to remember this is shot in the 50s, doubling for the 1870s. So they've gone to some sort of undeveloped part of the island. I didn't recognize really the coastline because it was obviously it's 70-year-old coastline anyway. But short of that, I mean, everything else, all the street stuff is all shot on a set. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
it's probably a set in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
like a Shaw Brothers set or something like that, just because of the number of extras that are there, that are Chinese extras. But it would have been great to have had, you know, a local star come in and play sort of the one speaking role there. And as far as I understand it, that's not the case. You get it a lot more in the American stuff and in the British
Mhm.
stuff at the beginning. I mean, there is a bounty of cameos in this movie.
Yeah.
You know, you got
Frank Sinatra.
Trevor Howard and Noel Coward and Gielgud at the beginning, and then you got Sinatra and George Raft and all the other Americans in the Wild West stuff. But as I understand it and as I recognize it, in some of those other moments, particularly the Hong Kong bit, they haven't really exploited that opportunity to the same way.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And like I think there's one uh in the Indian segment, I think there's like one actor of Indian descent who's I think he's the guy that was leading them on the elephant after the train tracks ran out
Oh yeah.
was the only Indian in the film, and everyone else was just white men in brown face, from what I could determine. You know,
Mm.
looking at them
Yeah.
fairly closely, and even in America, when they are on the train crossing the country, there's one segment where they stop the train to smoke the peace pipe with the Native Americans, who those seem to be native actors, you know.
Mhm.
And then later, when they are chased by the Sioux, those are all just white guys in brown face again. So it's interesting the choices that they made, and like when they thought it was important to get someone to actually represent the communities that they were trying to represent on this like world journey.
Mm.
And most of the time, if they were talking, it was just a white person, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, even those the Native Americans with the peace pipes, none of them spoke. There was not a word spoken by any of those actors, which
Right.
I found interesting.
Yeah.
Not even
actually,
not even a racist word. No one even said like how or
How or
anything.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I didn't pick up. There was a couple things, and I forgot to write them down. I remember thinking there was only a couple comments that I thought, ugh, that kind of sent a chill up my spine. Like, oh, I wouldn't say
Mhm.
that anymore. But by and large, considering the context and the length of this film, which is
Mhm.
incredible, it's surprisingly vanilla, even in its stereotypes.
Mm.
It doesn't really go into a lot of things where we just cringe. It's cringe adjacent. There's a
Yeah.
lot of things that are getting into the areas where we would just these days go no, 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 but they seem to pull back from it, and
Mhm.
maybe for their time period they were being progressive in their own minds.
I mean, you have to think.
The-
I mean, could I just want to very quickly touch on what you just said? It's like when you said where today we would go no, no, no. So would we? You know, there's a number of these movies that you watch today. You know, where they go to different parts of the world, and they're still falling into the same stereotypical representations. In in these big sort of budget Hollywood movies, I'm thinking of you, Michael Bay. People, big budget movies where we'll have a scene in Hong Kong or we'll have a scene in India, and yeah, they're probably more likely to use a recognizable local star now than ever before.
Mhm.
But the character and the representation is, I think, every bit as likely to be some slightly clunky, slightly kind of narrow-minded representation of what they're really like, just as a kind of shorthand, because at the end of the day, they are still trying to address a middle American audience who I think still today, yes, they've got a phone in their pocket that they can look at this stuff. I think in a lot of ways, they're still maybe just as ignorant about the parts of the world and different communities as they were back then. And I don't mean to upset
I
anybody by saying so, but
yeah, that's probably very true. But I think, like you said, the main difference is that nowadays they wouldn't put a white person in brown face in most cases. They would just
Yeah.
pay someone from that local, local scene, a local actor or whatever to do the cringe stuff, and you write a big enough check and people will do a lot of things,
Absolutely.
What I did find was that this film, because it obviously it did win Best Picture at the Oscars, If memory serves, it feels to me like this is the first film that then sort of set the template for what would become known as a kind of Oscar movie, an awards movie. From this point onwards, really, up until, well, I mean, even today, to some degree, it's the big, sweeping, expensive location shot epic, normally historical, normally based on a true story or a lauded literary text or whatever. That would be deemed okay. This is the big winner. I'm thinking of your Lawrence of Arabia's and going up to your Braveheart and English Patient and all the rest of it. Ben-Hur, of course, is just around the corner. This for me feels like the first one of those. This a big sweeping, worthy awards baity kind of epic that really kind of sort of set the tone and set the pace of what was going to be awarded and rewarded going forward from this point.
I mean, I think that's definitely a part of it. It's interesting, with the films that you mentioned, like the way that they contrast with this film is that Around the World in 80 Days is a deeply unserious film. Like it is downright silly in most cases. And the ones that you mentioned didn't. And like even looking at the other films that were nominated in 1956, I mean, it's a great year for movies, and some of the other films that year also have similar scope. You've got, I think, what, Ten Commandments is in there.
Giant as well.
Giant,
King and I.
Yeah, they're all big films, like big feeling films, and so it is interesting that this is the one that went home with the trophy. But I don't disagree with the idea that it's these big the films with grand scope that start to fill in those holes, and a lot of that has to do, I think, probably with the time period that this film is coming out in. It's in the mid 50s, and they're kind of at a place where we're kind of reaching again right now, where they're fighting with television for viewers. Television's getting big then, and so that's why you get the advent of CinemaScope and the advent of Tadeo and all of Cinerama and all these other like gimmicks to get people to come out to see things they can't see at home.
Right.
And so we were talking before the recording that I was out today seeing Twisters in 40X. Like that's something I can't do at my house. It's worth driving 30 miles from me to have an experience that I can only have in a cinema. And Around the World in 80 Days feels a lot like that. It feels like you can't see this at your house. Come out and experience this grand adventure with us.
You pose a really interesting question there, because it was nominated for Best Picture alongside The King and I, but I think I'm thinking of Giant and the Ten Commandments. Giant for me feels like sort of the edgier, more modern choice. Like if it was today, I feel like Giant would win. But the Ten Commandments seems like a slam dunk. Why didn't the Ten Commandments win? Why? What is it about Around the World in 80 Days that one audience is over, or one vote is over, I should say, in a way that the Ten Commandments didn't?
I am baffled by that question myself. It's, I mean, I'm looking at the list of top films of 56. The Searchers is 1956 also. Like there are plenty of films that would feel like they are more the sort of, I mean, I don't know what we feel like as Oscar films today. Like we don't typically give comedies Best Picture Oscars these days,
Right.
And it's only recently that we've started even considering films, outside of straight dramas for that prize. That's
Lord of the Rings, fantasy.
Lord of the Rings, fantasy. We've got Shape of Water a few years ago, and Parasite. In the 90s, it was a big deal when Silence of the Lambs got the award. But those are still outliers compared to. And I can't remember. I mean, I'm not as probably as up on the best pictures as you guys are doing this series, but I don't know of many recent comedies that have been in that conversation or taken the
I
award
mean, the
home.
one that springs to mind was Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah,
That came
yeah,
out, but such an outlier, such an odd,
yeah.
yeah,
weird little movie. Just
yeah.
at a time, I think, I think it benefited from the pandemic and all those kind of things, and this boost in desire for diversity and representation, and it was a beautiful conflux of all of these different agendas and influences.
A more accessible movie too. It was a much more accessible movie, than
And
Tar was,
as much, and I love that film. I saw it 3 times in theaters. I was there for the premiere. I sat across the aisle from Michelle Yeoh the whole time.
Nice.
It's a wonderful film. I'm still shocked that it won that award, but at the same time, it feels like the Oscar these days feels different than the Oscar did in 1956. Obviously, it was a lot more prestigious, bigger, more glamorous event then, because the world was a much smaller place, and so it's things like Everything Everywhere All at Once winning nowadays, or Parasite a few years ago, or things like that, are becoming these sort of targets for people talking about how the Oscars lost the prestige among common people, and viewership numbers are down because you're nominating these movies that no one's going to see and they're not
Right.
blockbusters. And then you get the whole what was that, the Zack Snyder bullshit popularity contest award that happened a couple of years ago.
It's totally
While they're
backfired on them.
desperately trying to get, yeah. And so it's a different time now for that sort of thing. Whereas Everything Everywhere All at Once was one of my favorite films of that year. Like, if that film had come out even 3 or 4 years beforehand, I don't think it had a chance
No, no.
at that sort of
Yeah.
recognition.
That's what I mean. It was at a moment. I mean, I think what we've found doing this series is that invariably, certainly in this period of time that we're looking at right now, the big hits of the year were winning. The films that were that were taking home the gold were, the box office successes as well. And I think we're a little far removed at the moment still from that period of time. I think in the 80s and the 90s, when there was this push by people like Weinstein actually to get sort of prestigious, arty, highbrow dramas, onto the podium, as it were, and audiences were checking out. I think the great outlier in that period was Titanic. But everything else around that time were, they were small movies that nobody really cared about. And I think recently, I think a lot of the sea change has been to do with the shift in diversity among the membership. This huge drive in Hollywood after sort of the Oscars So White controversies of about a decade ago. It's like, no, we've got to think differently. We've got to assess movies differently, and it has become something else. But I think coming back to where we are now, mid-50s, there was a growing appreciation within the industry for the potential of cinema and just how big and how grand you could go with this just as a spectacle. And I think that's why for the next decade or so, predominantly it's huge epics, big glossy musicals, movies like that, movies that really pop visually and technically, and where all the money is up there on stage. Those are the films that are going to get rewarded, are going to, where you just see the work that's been put in. And I think it's, there's a lot of that long running joke at the Oscars about best editing often goes to most editing. And that seems to be true with Best Picture from now for the next sort of couple of decades. It's like most picture.
Well, it's interesting with Around the World in that it wins Best Picture, but it gets no acting awards. And so for me, that's a telltale sign that this was embraced by that crowd in 1956 because of its sheer audacity. Man, it went for the fences. We always talk about, hitting for the fences. And or aiming for the fences? Is it
You
shooting?
do. It's swinging for the fences.
Swinging for the fences.
And I can't believe I had to correct your bloody
I know,
baseball
suddenly
analogy because I never understand them.
Well,
But
it's because I've been hanging around with these Brits so long. It's screwing up with my Americanness.
it's just not cricket, I tell you.
It's throwing off my, yeah, it's a bit of a sticky wicket I found myself in right now.
There you go.
No, I mean, there's just, I mean, around the world in 80 days, we're in India and we're in Hong Kong and we're in these wonderful places. And for a 1956 audience, they're getting to see this. And the voting guild here is I think so bowled over by this. But you said earlier, how did Around the World win and Ten Commandments not? But I would argue Ten Commandments did win, because what has really figured in the zeitgeist of film cinema history is Ten Commandments. Everybody has seen Ten Commandments. That thing is on every Easter. I grew up, I probably have seen Ten Commandments 20 times in my life. It's woven into the DNA of the country. I mean, Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, you know, Moses. I mean, my brother would say that every time we get into an argument as a kid growing up. Steve,
Really?
Steve, and Steve. You know, it'd be like, and so, I mean, to me, the telltale sign, and we brought this up before, Josh, is what is actually, well, I'm getting ahead of myself about standing the test of time, but what is carried with cinema zeitgeist up through today? What's really remembered from that time period, as opposed to what won the gold that year? And when you see things like King and I and Ten Commandments particularly, and to lesser degrees like Friendly Persuasion, these are movies that are much more beloved and remembered more fondly.
I've never heard of Friendly Persuasion. I'm sorry.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've never heard of it. I mean, look at it, Civil War drama, William Wyler, Gary Q. Oh, cool. I should know this movie. I should have seen this movie. I have never heard of it.
You know why I do? It's one of my mom's favorite movies. That's why my mom loved it. I remember she had it on VHS, Friendly Persuasion. It was just one of, we watched together. So
are you sure that's what that tape was? Okay. But
it wasn't, now that you say it, it wasn't store-bought.
Yeah, well, there you go. But it does seem kind of interesting that you do have the Ten Commandments, which is, I would agree, probably has stood the test of time longer than any other movie that was in the running this year. But it came into the race with 7 nominations. But then on the night, only one Best Visual Effects, and that was it. It was like the Red Sea was parted and the spoils were shared by The King and I and Around the World in 80 Days on the night. Yeah. And leaving the Ten Commandments just to take home just that solitary statuette for Best Visual Effects, and that was it. I mean, Giant had 10 nominations. It went in on the night with the most nominations, and then, I mean, did it win anything at all?
Confession.
It won Best Director. Yeah,
I've never seen Giant. Confession.
Oh, it's great. It really is. It really is great, and but it feels very ahead of its time. It feels far more like the kind of movie one of those new Hollywood directors would make in the 70s. Or it feels like a kind of There Will Be Blood type of movie, where it doesn't have a traditional structure and, it's sprawling and it's kind of modern. It feels there's that whole third act, which takes place kind of much later after Jet Rink has become incredibly wealthy, which just feels so bizarre in the context of the 2 acts, which are far more like a traditional kind of almost like a Western before it. It's been a little while since I saw it, but yeah, you're right. James Dean got nominated 2 years in a row posthumously. This was the second time. But I
mean, 80 Days did come away with several technical awards, I believe, also for sound, and that was one of the big things with Todd AO, even after because the Todd AO system started off, I did a little reading this morning because I've always been curious about it. It was a 70 millimeter project recording system, 6-track audio, like that kind of thing. Again, you could only do in theaters, and over time, it's shrunk down to a 35 millimeter Todd AO format that then became just like CinemaScope, and so it wasn't as prestigious as it was in those first 2 films. Like it was Oklahoma and this one. One of the things that made them unique was that it was this 70 millimeter uh, film format that was shot at 30 frames a second for whatever reason. And so with Oklahoma, they shot sequentially. They shot it in 35, in 70 millimeters at 30 frames a second, and then shot it again at at 24 frames a second on 35 millimeter film. And for 80 days, they shot both of them at the same time. They shot 70 millimeter 30 frames and 70 millimeter 24 frames. I
So
think
they had
side
two
by
cameras
side,
going side by side.
just at different frame rates.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things you're talking about, what stands the test of time, is part of it has to do with some technical limitations with that sort of thing. Is that there's not, there's never been a high definition release, a Blu-ray release of Around the World in 80 Days, and certainly not an ultra high definition. I was reading up on this more. It hasn't been restored since it was restored for DVD 20 years ago. And I just think that's a shame, because I was watching it. I have the DVD set, but I was watching it on Apple, because on Apple TV it said it was HD. I was like, oh, I'll give it a shot. It doesn't look like HD. It looks pretty rough. There's a lot of damage to the print, that could be fixed if someone went in and restored it. But there's, to what end becomes the question then, for the people that fund that sort of thing.
Is there a demand?
Right.
Yeah, is there going to recoup the cost that it would take to restore something with this, sort of very unique origin, so that's part of, I think, the reason why it does sort of, things do sort of fall out of the conversation. They fall out of relevance over time, as apart from the obvious cultural insensitivities that are just part and parcel of films from the 50s that are trying to do this sort of thing. I looking at it as with a modern lens is icky a lot of times, but we're adults. We can
Exactly. We can look at it in context and understand it.
Yeah. But there is the challenge of, okay, well, how do we restore this properly? Then how do we capitalize on it? Is it, because the negatives are apparently somewhere being taken care of by someone. They're just not doing anything with them. So is that enough, for the film? And I was reading out the history about it, again, about how there are multiple versions of the film that have been, chopped and edited over the years. And the one that's available on DVD and on Apple is the most complete roadshow version of the film, with the complete overture and the intermission and all that stuff.
That's the word I was trying to remember earlier. Overture. Yeah. So what's the bit of music at the beginning called?
Oh yeah. And then the Edward Morrow intro and
I wanted to talk about this bizarre introduction.
And to the earth, from the earth to the moon. They show the whole mini silent film.
The first 10 minutes is another movie.
Yeah, it's like an introduction to Jules Verne. It's like in Hugo, where they do this. They go, like, "Hey, you don't know who George Méliès is? Okay, we're going to talk to you about George Méliès for 15 minutes."
But if you think about it, it's a wonderful, with where they're going with just this Todd A.O. cinescope. We're going to show you where we're going to put you in this world of Jules Verne, and then we're going to open it up, and you could just see probably a 1956 audience going, "Oh." Whoa.
It works incredibly well, even just watching it on TV. It's a really smart introduction to the work of Jules Verne and what his vision was, and what he wanted. They contextualize it brilliantly. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I hadn't even thought that far. That if you're sitting there watching this in Todd A.O. 70mm and it starts like that, and it's like, look how far we've come. It kind of makes total sense, doesn't it?
And I think, I hope, I don't know for sure, but I remember being obsessed with Jules Verne when I was a kid and reading those books. Like, those were my favorite books, 130, 140-year-old books when I was, 7 and 8 years old. And they instilled a sort of wonder in me, and seeing a film like this, or, even the Harryhausen films that are made from his stories also, those are all, that's the stuff that I kind of fell in love with. And even seeing those first sequences in widescreen, when the camera lens is so wide that you feel like you're inside of whatever's happening, And apparently back in when Tadeo was developed, it was developed to be sort of like Cinerama with the curved screen. And so
Mhm.
you were just sort of more inside of the image. They didn't go very far with that, but that's kind of why it's almost distorted in those ultra wide sequences that they have. A lot of the travelogue sequences, like with the train across the states, a lot of that footage is the same way as well. But even just the opening footage in London of just people walking around, it feels immense, and
Mm.
there's not really immense things happening on screen. It's just the way that it's shot makes it feel so huge that it's very. I can imagine, like you said, being in a theater, being like, "Wow, I'm here. Like I'm in
Yeah.
this. I'm a part
Mhm.
of this."
I guess that's
Which
I
And
guess that's
eh,
just what I guess that's the reason. I guess that's why it won. It was just this sort
that's
of
yeah.
overwhelming sense of innovation and spectacle that Ten Commandments maybe didn't quite have, or maybe it was quite close between the two. Who knows? But it doesn't feel like it was just because Ten Commandments didn't win sort of much else. But yeah, it does feel that they were even if by today's standards the story and the execution of the narrative is somewhat lacking or somewhat dated or somewhat even insubstantial. Like you say, it's a fairly lightweight, goofy comedy for large stretches of it. It was just one of those moments where they were like, look, we've got this great new system, this great new toy. It was like an Avatar moment, maybe, where they're
yeah,
just like, look at what we can do. And people were just like, yeah, okay, you sold me. We're right behind you, at least this year.
Well, James and Josh, another thing to consider is the Academy may be thinking, what were we drinking when we gave Cecil B. DeMille the greatest show on earth, the best picture? And there's no way we're making that mistake again.
Very
And
true.
yet, Ten Commandments is the far superior film. And yet, Josh, when we did Greatest Show on Earth, we pretty much conceded of pretty much all the every best pictures we've done up till now, that probably deserves its place in history the least.
Mm,
the one thing that I found least believable in the entire film wasn't even the fact that Shirley MacLaine was playing an Indian woman. It was the fact that she was so desperately attracted to Phileas Fogg, who has absolutely nothing going on, but she's just so desperate to marry him. When you've got Passepartout, who has been, mentioned and demonstrated throughout the film that he is a ladies' man
Yeah.
and, a charisma machine, like with them the entire time. I thought that was like, I mean, it's the story they have to follow, but it was also
Yeah.
fairly unbelievable.
for sure. But he's the Englishman of indeterminate wealth, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
she's gonna hitch her wagon to that prosperous opportunity, I suppose.
Well, and
You know,
we haven't really mentioned David Niven that much, except in
it's true.
passing. Even though he
Mhm.
plays the straight man, I enjoy his performance. Obviously, despite I can see where we're going with our final judgment on this film. But be that as it may, this film has constantly being remade. I mean, we have Pierce
Mhm.
Brosnan and Eric Idle doing it in the 80s, I believe. Steve
Hmm.
Coogan and Jackie Chan doing it. It was an animated cartoon when I was a kid growing up. I can still hear that theme song playing in my head. So although this film may not have kind of had the legs to keep going, the story itself seems to
Mhm.
resonate with people. And so, I think, I mean, I enjoyed Pierce Brosnan. It's been a long time since I've seen that one, but I remember enjoying it. I always loved Steve Coogan. Unfortunately, I didn't feel that version played well. And I think there was even a BBC TV series recently around the world in
Yeah,
80
not too long
days.
ago. I haven't seen it yet, but
Yeah,
yeah, just about
Yeah, with
two,
David
yeah,
3 years
Tennant,
ago.
I think
yeah.
did one a couple of years ago, something like
Yeah,
that.
and so obviously the story resonates, as I said, but I think David Niven by far he is the quintessential Englishman, and I think he pulls it off brilliantly. We may not like that character, but
Mm.
he's a good guy. He means well. Might not be somebody I want to hang around all the time, but David Niven plays it extraordinarily well. I feel.
I mean, he does look like Phileas Fogg. I mean, when I think of Phileas Fogg, it is like
Yeah,
that. That's what he looks
David
like.
Niven.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
I think if there is a reason we haven't really been talking about the character and that he doesn't leap off the page, it's not David Niven's fault. It's the character, and I think
No.
the character is the whole point is that the character is kind of a cipher. And I think that the
Mhm.
reason why the movie and the story continues to linger and stay with us and remain relevant is because you can reflect any other global cultural issue you want back on him, and it will always work.
Mhm.
It's a great sort of vessel to tell stories about international relationships and all the rest of it. And I think for that reason, it will remain, relevant and important.
Should we turn it over to Josh now to render the verdict, the first verdict of one, does it stand the test of time? And two, does it deserve its place in Oscar history?
I believe that it does stand the test of time, just for the reasons that you mentioned. It's certainly it may feel dated, but it's also a snapshot of where cinema was. Like it is cinematic in every way possible. And there aren't a lot of films before this, certainly, that that are attempting this same sort of like large scale global
Mhm.
adventure,
Right.
the way that this film does. Does it deserve its place in Oscar history? That's more questionable, I think. The Best Picture with the things it was up against, and even things like I was mentioning before, like even The Searchers and other films that were out that year. You know, were there films that, if you looked back at the list of films from 1956 and you didn't know which one had won the award, would you have chosen this one? No, I don't think most people
No.
without that prior knowledge would choose Around the World in 80 Days.
Uh, I'm tacking slightly different as far as standing the test of time. I don't think it has, by and large, and that it just, for a lot of the reasons we mentioned earlier, it seems to be forgotten by a lot of moviegoers. It's other films that it was up against in that time period, even the ones that weren't nominated, like The Searchers, are far more remembered and beloved than Around the World in 80 Days. But I also think, for the reasons Josh mentioned, although he said it maybe is questionable whether it deserves its place in Oscar history, I think for the time that it was in 1956, I believe it deserved its place in Oscar history. I'm not saying that it deserved to win by saying that. What I'm saying is, I don't look at it the way I would look at, like, uh, Greatest Show on Earth, and think, what the hell was that even do being nominated? This was a beautiful spectacle. And if I was a theater cinema goer in 1956, I may have a completely different understanding of this film. And I think so. It does deserve its place in history for that time period, but I don't think it stands the test of time for us today.
Okay. All right. I'm going to kind of land somewhere in the middle, I think. Um, does it stand the test of time? I think no, but at the same time, that's why I like it. I think that the story in and of itself is such a specific kind of period piece.
Mhm.
It is very much sort of its time, capturing a moment, satirizing a particular moment in British history, if not global history. This is, I think, the best adaptation of that. It's my favorite, but in order to succeed at being my favorite adaptation of that, it has to be somewhat antiquated and creaky and outdated, because if you updated it and made it far more palatable for today's audiences, you're missing the point. I think that would kind of be to its detriment. And so I like the fact that it feels kind of its time and a little bit creaky and old and
Mhm.
archaic. So what does that mean? Does that mean sort of, so no, but yeah, no, but that's what I like about it. Does it deserve its place in Oscar history? No, I don't think so. As I mentioned earlier, I think
Mhm.
were we doing the award, giving the award to one of those today, I would give it to Giant, no question. I
Mhm.
think that is the best, most accomplished film, but I think it kind of baffled people a little bit at the time as well. Ten Commandments feels like the comfortable, easy choice. That, if like Josh said, if you didn't know and you were looking at the ballot today, you'd probably guess that the Ten Commandments won.
You ought to be in pictures, oh, what a hit you would be. Your voice